What did Mao want the power for? He was already number one in everything. His reputation was so high. There's nothing you could do to damage him that much. And he himself said, if I want to knock down Liu Shaoqi, the so-called number two leader, all I need is just one single finger. Rong Chang and John Halliday, the book Mao the Unknown Story, they really want to demonize China. They don't want to write history. Of course, history is always about the present. It's not just them. But their intention is not to really to offer history. It's to how to demonize Mao. Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier during the era of Mao, was asked by a French journalist what to think of the French Revolution. And he said it's still too early to say. But in fact, I think that's the wrong story. The real story is he was asked about the Cultural Revolution. And Zhou Enlai said it is still early to say.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hello everyone. For our show today, I'm excited to welcome Professor Gao Mobo. He is an academic, an author, and currently a professor of Chinese studies in the University of Adelaide. Today we'll discuss his book, The Battle of China's Past, Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Thank you very much for being with us today, Professor Gao.
My pleasure.
Would you like to introduce the book to the listeners?
The book aims to address both the audience both in China and outside of China. But unfortunately, the book cannot be made available in China, although a template version of Chinese is done, but you can't get anybody to publish it. So I aim to counter several assertions or theories or propositions or assertions about Mao and the Cultural Revolution, which I think are either totally wrong or partially wrong or can be interpreted differently. I mean, I aim to debunk several myths. One is that Mao launched the Cultural Revolution as a personal struggle to get rid of his rivals in the party. I don't think that is true. And secondly, economy was on the brink of collapse by the 1976, and China didn't develop economy that much, and China's economy developed only in post-Mao China. That's the second myth I want to debunk. The third one is the understanding or the myth that there is a category of people called the Chinese. I think that is true. Apart from different ethnic groups, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and so on and so forth, there are classes of people. People, there's no such thing as the Chinese. So the people who have the resources to write history claim they speak on behalf of the Chinese, but I don't think that is true. I want to show the readers that there are people who don't agree with the written version of the Cultural Revolution and the Mao. And these people are actually the majority.
Why did Mao initiate the Cultural Revolution, and how successful was it in achieving what he intended?
What has started Mao's intention of the Cultural Revolution went back further. What happened in Eastern Europe under the umbrella of the former socialist camps and headed by the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, there are protests and unrests. And Mao tried to draw a lesson from that. So he thought that even in a socialist country, people can be unhappy about lots of things. The ruling party, the government can do things that not necessarily for the interest of the people. And they can be bureaucratic, for instance, and they can be corrupt. and they can be work for their own interest. So actually, he launched the what they call the 200s. Let the hundreds of flowers blossom. Let the hundred schools of thoughts contend in 1957 or 56. His idea was that, okay, let the people criticize the party, talk about what's wrong so that we can improve. But that backfired. Backfired in the sense that most of the people criticized the party and the government with a good intention to improve. But some people wanted to overthrow the Communist Party. So to the extent that the party itself, most of them didn't want this movement, this sort of 200s to start with. But once criticism went so far, and there was a strong opinion inside the party against Mao, so Mao had to rein in. And that went to these what are called anti-rightist movements. Made lots of victims, 500,000 or something like that. And in fact, Deng Xiaoping was the manager in doing that. So that failed. Mao had to put his idea of reforming the party on the back burner because, there was such a strong reaction from the party, and also some elements of society wanted to really get rid of the Communist Party. And then there was the Great Leap Forward from 1958. Again, the Great Leap Forward failed, and it led to a large famine. We cannot deny that. But the program was still trying to be different from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, from point of Mao, was too much concentration. There was a planning, yes, 5-year plan. China still have that. China used to have that as well. It's a copy of Soviet Union, but China under the Mao didn't want to go that far. He wanted to what he called the 2 legs walking. One is central planning, one is local initiative. So he wanted to develop local industries, initiated by the people themselves. And so there was mushroom growing of local enterprises. It's called production brigade and commune enterprises. Again, this is the thing. Things could always go to the extreme. So the Great Leap Forward policies of encouraging people to take an initiative to develop local industry, instead of everything controlled by the center, went to extreme as well, as I described in my Gao Village book. For instance, in order to catch up with the UK at that time in making iron and steel production, because iron and steel production was believed to be the symbol of industrialization. You need iron and steel to make machines, to make railways, make everything. So they have a plan. In 1959, we have to have this much of iron and steel production, and then imposed a quota on the province. The province imposed a quota on the county, and down to the commune. I mean, local people, they don't have the technology and expertise or the materials, resources to make iron and steel. So in order to fulfill the quota, as I described in my Gao Village book, they took utensils from families and break them as iron and steel products, which is ridiculous. So again, things went to extreme, and then it was disastrous, and then again Mao had to rein in and then retreat. But the spirit of local industrialization reignited during the Cultural Revolution, and that led to the development of village and township enterprises in the 80s. It was important contribution to industrialization in post-Mao development. Even Deng Xiaoping was surprised. I didn't know he could develop so fast. Of course he didn't, because he didn't, he didn't understand the Mao's policy. The Great Leap Forward failed, and Mao had to retreat again. And then things getting more and more serious because the bureaucracy, the self-interest of the party holders, officials. I'll give you an example, like the healthcare. And Mao was bursted in anger and talked to the Minister of Healthcare. How much did you invest in rural China, which is the majority of Chinese people? And your most of your budget is on the urban sector. And of that, a large portion of that is on the party officials. And they have the privileges to this and that. So that, for instance, led to the barefoot doctor system and people sending to the countryside to help the rural people during the Cultural Revolution. That's an example, okay. So it's like today in the United States of America. China was going to develop that way. You have the investment, the budget, the money, resources on a few. You develop very sophisticated machines, equipment to cure the rich, to look after the rich, whereas you don't do anything for ordinary people who are dying in mess or sickness. So Mao wanted the prevention, wanted to care for the ordinary people, the majority of people, not spending China at that time, very little resources on the elite, the party officials, and so-called the highly technical care, So when you get to 70, 80, you have this disease and that disease, and it's very difficult, very expensive to look after. But China couldn't afford to do that kind of things. You have to look at the people who had no care at all. So again, Mao thought every time he tried to do something, he's always knocked back. And then, not partly because of the resistance within the party, but partly because of people interpret him very differently, did things to the extreme, and then things go bad. So he thought Cultural Revolution was the way of doing it as an experiment to launch the large people of mass and put the party officials in front of them and say, you criticize yourself. You tell the people what you have done. And the people can say, no, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, blah, 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 blah. So it's a kind of a self-criticism and self-criticism to reform the party, to face the masses, because there's no election. You don't face the people by election. How do you be held accountable? So the whole system, the accountability is the lower authorities to the upper authorities, and at every level, there's no accountability to the people that govern. So Mao thought the Cultural Revolution, by mobilizing the people, a mass movement, criticism, self-criticism, especially the party officials, is a way to hold them accountable, not to be too bureaucratic and have the spirit of serving the people. And most importantly, to change the mentality. So that's why the struggle against the old ideas, old traditions. Mentality, change the mentality. I mean, not right? In neoliberalism in the West is self-interest, individualism. Dawkins, selfish DNA. Right? People are human beings, are like animals, are genetically designed to be selfish, which it makes sense. Protect yourself to prolong life and maximize your own interest. But Mao thought And Mao is interesting because he was idealist. He thought by doing things, by impose some kind of values and accountability, people can change. You can change your mentality. Once you change your mentality, you can lead to new reality. And so he's what I call a constructionist. So that I think that was the intention of his Cultural Revolution. Whether you asked whether he succeeded, you remember the story. The story went or goes like this: Zhou Enlai, the premier, the Chinese premier during the era of Mao, was asked by a French journalist what do you think of the French Revolution, and he said it's still too early to say. But in fact, I think that's the wrong story. The real story is he was asked about the Cultural Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said it is still early to say. And I think that is true. It is still too early to say. But I can speculate on certain things. Okay, if you look at what happened to the Soviet Union, and it collapsed just like that. We're puzzled at that time, and people are still puzzled. And Xi Jinping is reported to have said, "What happened? Who is the man? Where is the man who stand up to defend the Soviet Union?" So, China didn't collapse like that. I think it is partly because of the Cultural Revolution. And nowadays, for instance, Xi Jinping was of my generation, grew up, educated during the era of Mao, and sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. He was there in a village for 7 years, from production, ordinary peasant, to become a leader and a commune leader, and then so on and so forth. He worked very hard to prove himself, and he succeeded. Now he still holds the party together. He's saying, this Chinese 不忘初心, don't forget the initial idea of communism or 1949 revolution, which is to serve the people, the majority of the people, not just minority elite. So, like anti-corruption, policies against poverty, 800 people lifted out of absolute poverty, and placed restraints on capitalists like Jack Ma of the Alibaba, who wanted to create an online bank to lend money with no financial substance, just to lend money and to make profits. And he was stopped from doing that. So, in other words, there are lots of capitalists, rich people in China. You can make profits, you can live whatever kind of life you can, but don't think you can run the country. You can't influence policies like the capitalists in the West, so-called democratic societies. So I think to that extent, Mao succeeded. There's a new left in China, for instance. You never had that in the Soviet Union. Can you think of a new left in the Soviet Union? Before or even after? So new left like Wang Hui, Wang Shaoguang, Cui Ziyuan, and Liu Xinyu, Yang Hailong, the whole group of people who still, Wang Hui, for instance, was in the, at high up in the party organs. He professor at Tsinghua University, and he always proposed policies and that kind of things. So I think to the extent that Mao succeeded, but there was a huge backlash against him and against the Cultural Revolution afterwards. That's not a discussion. So, in other words, and if you look at interesting, Mao is still very, very popular among the people. And I give you an example. There's the authorities established two websites, one for Deng Xiaoping, one for Mao Zedong. And if you look at the website of Mao Zedong, most of the comments and remarks are positive and try to remember him and so on and so forth. Whereas on the website of Deng Xiaoping, it was too much criticism, negative attitudes toward him, and the authority had to close it down. That's different from the elite official presentation of two people. That's one of the reasons why I want to write a book. There's no such a thing as the Chinese, a different category of people. And so the Chinese, the working class, the rural people, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the Spartan life, everything was rationed, and they still have a very fond memory of Mao and that period. This is very counterintuitive, but that's a fact.
What are the biggest misconceptions about Mao Zedong that you wanted to debunk in the book?
Rong Chang and John Halliday, the book Mao the Unknown Story, they really want to demonize China. They don't want to write history. Of course, history is always about the present. It's not just them. But their intention is not to really to offer history, is to how to demonize Mao, how to make him look like a monster, not just like a monster of Stalin. I mean, even like Hitler. That's what they're trying to do. So they select evidence or even fabricate evidence. Of course, everybody selects evidence. You can't put all evidence on the table. That is true. When I write my book, I also select evidence. But there's a difference. I select evidence in order to counter the overwhelming mainstream narrative. I want to show you evidence that when not selected, neglected. But they select evidence to support a narrative that Mao was a monster and the Cultural Revolution was a personal struggle. But they didn't ask the question, or they don't ask the question, what did Mao want the power for? He was already number one in everything. His reputation was so high. There's nothing you could do to damage him that much. And he himself said, if I want to knock down Liu Shaoqi, the so-called number two leader, all I need is just one single finger. In fact, in 1996, during the party congress, he just wrote a few lines on a newspaper criticizing Liu Shaoqi. In 1996, that was the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Liu Shaoqi was already demoted because of that. When the Chinese announced the Communist Party Congress or meetings, they list the lineups, Mao Zedong, Lin Biao, Zhou Enlai, and Liu Shaoqi was already number 8. Deng Xiaoping was ahead of him. So in other words, it's so easy to knock down Liu Shaoqi if it's just a personal struggle. But the Cultural Revolution lasted so-called another 10 years. Liu Shaoqi was not there. Why was still the Cultural Revolution? So he has policies, his ideas. So you don't look at the people. I mean, there's a party. It's not as if Mao is the party. No, he's not. The party is so complicated. The Chinese are so many different classes, different interests, and different interests represented the party sectors as well. So I want to show that is not the case. It's not a personal power struggle. And as I said in the book, like Rong Chang and Halliday, they're so deceptive, If you look at the notes, tens and hundreds of pages, and the people they interviewed, tens and hundreds of them, including, as I said, Wałęsa of the Polish workers' movement, or the brother of the Japanese emperor, or Dalai Lama, or Mao Zedong's daughters, Li Na and Li Min. But in the book, you could not find what Li Na, Li Min said about their fathers. You say you interviewed Mao's daughters, but you don't present what they said. What's the point? Because what they said didn't support their intention. And you said this is unknown story, this is all new. But there's nothing new there, not much. I mean, you can't just write about Mao and Cultural Revolution or from Mao. such a complicated history without referring to what other people have said them before. And they wrote as if there was no literature in the field. Oh, this is a new continent. I discovered it. It is ridiculous.
I would say the most well-known figures of the Cultural Revolution are Lin Biao, Vice Chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and also Vice Premier, and the Gang of Four, which included Mao's wife Jiang Qing. What are the misconceptions about them that you aim to challenge in your book?
Okay, I start with Lin Biao. Okay, I didn't go that much in the book, but I still can't say much about him because the Lin Biao affair is still a mystery. From what I know, I've read all people have written about it by both Chinese accounts and Western scholars, like the well-known Tyrwhitt Australian author Wallen Sun, for instance, and the memoirs of those closest to Lin Biao as far as they could go. Lin Biao was very, very sick all his second half of his life before 1970 incident. Or that 70 or 71. I think it's 1970, 13th of September. His plane went down and he died. It's still a mystery, very hard to know. But what I can be certain is he was very sick. He was on drug all the time. Apart from some very serious matters, he didn't care what's going on outside the world. And all the information he could get is from his wife, his secretary. So the family was not in a very good relationship. The daughter and the son are not in good relationship, and the daughter and the mother were not in good relationship. And the fact that he just got on the plane and ran away like that, I think he was more or less drugged or hijacked by his wife and son in a panic. That's how I understand it. But Lin Biao himself was a brilliant man, especially as a general in fighting. I think he, on the other hand, he had limitations in terms of ideological thinking or intellect. He supported Mao during the Cultural Revolution, and Mao was very clever in order to secure his position in fighting all the people in the party. And that is true. He was fighting all the people in the party himself. He wanted the people to rise up against the party, which is, lots of people would think he's a lunatic and he's suicidal. But in order to do that, he needed some support. Zhou Enlai supported him. Lin Biao supported him. When Lin Biao supported him, because he was defense minister, he had such a reputation as a marshal or general. And therefore, Lin Biao's support meant the army is with him, and therefore Mao felt secure in that sense. And it was Lin Biao, for instance, who got this so-called Little Red Book. So put these Mao's quotations together and making this Little Red Book. Mao wasn't that happy, but he thought, okay, with his support, I have to give in. If you get one's quotation out of a context, you can always get it wrong, Although, every sentence is exciting, like the power grows out of the barrel of a gun, It's very, very well-known, exciting saying, but you have to depend on the context, or imperialism is paper tiger. I mean, it's very interesting, good saying, but tigers do kill people. It's not that superficial. Mao understood that, but he was speaking strategically. So this kind of sayings, can arouse the people, and the teenagers can be inspired, and then it would go to extreme, that kind of things. So another famous one is马克主义的道理千条万岁. 总结起来是一句话：造反有理。So some Marxism has lots of nuances and logic and thinking, but if you summarize, it justifies to rebel. So the youngsters, of course, like this. So that little red book worked to that extent. So Lin Biao was well known because of that, and so on and so forth. But I think later he was disillusioned with the Cultural Revolution himself, and I think that is probably true. And he retreated further to his bedroom, but he couldn't voice any dissent against Mao openly. So that probably contributed to the distance between them, and then the panic suffered by the family. 为什么江青？江青 again is portrayed in the media, official media, and memoirs of the party officials as a monster. I don't think that is true. Jiang Jun doesn't have a good personality. It's very hard to get on with him. And Mao himself said several times, she's quarrelsome, she's not accommodating. A journal said, where Jiang Qin sleeps, you have to walk carefully, because if you wake her up, she'll be angry. That kind of things. But the two things about Jiang Qin, one is that because he was an actress, in Chinese tradition, acting was not considered a honorable profession. And young an actress and from Shanghai, decadent city, and marry Mao, and she was not qualified for it, according to the old revolutionary ethics. She didn't fight guerrilla warfare like Zhu De's wife or Deng Xiaoping's wife and those kind of things. But also in Chinese, lots of Chinese party officials and the army officers, they were from rural China. Although they were taught and went through revolution, taught about communist ideology, but they still inherited lots of traditional ideas. One is to look down on women. They think women have to be subservient. Jiang Qin shouldn't be conspicuous on political stage. So they didn't like that. But Jiang Qin had her own ideas. She was one of the true followers of Mao. Like we talk about the change of mentality, change of value ideas. So Mao didn't like why it's called the Cultural Revolution, because it was cultural to start with. And the first article by Yao Wenyuan, one of the Gang of Four, was targeted at Beijing mayor Wuhan and these people, because they wrote plays and put up performances. These plays and performances either or critical of the Communist Party, or not directly, but indirectly, or it's about ghosts, emperors, beautiful women, elites. So Mao was not happy. We are a communist party. We make a revolution. Why don't you do something? Why don't you write and perform to reflect the working people, the ordinary people? So he was angry. And Jiang Qin wanted to do something about that. And to start with, working on the Peking opera. Because Peking opera is although traditional for only 200 years old. Before that, there was no Peking opera. There were lots of traditional operas. It was during the Qing dynasty. The emperor wanted to see theatrical performances. He brought hundreds of theatrical groups to Beijing, and through the performance, eventually the Peking opera grew out of it. But it was considered traditional, and people like it, and I like it as well. So Jiang Qin was the real initiator and the leader in reforming the Peking opera. To me, it's hugely successful, both in content and artistic values. It was unprecedented. It combined the Chinese past with the present, and which is what Mao said, combines Chinese with the West. So like a music instrument. I mean, picking opera used to have gongs and the Chinese violins, erhu, and very few musical instruments. And now the picking up, you have violin, you have piano, you have Western instruments. It's just so dramatic. He combined it so well. And it's not more about emperors and empresses and lords and rich people, but about ordinary people, PAL soldiers, workers, peasants. What's wrong with it? Well, the elite didn't like that. Wang Hongyuan was a worker, and Mao wanted to promote him. And he was a worker. He served as soldier during the Korean War. Mao thought he embodied everything about ordinary people. It was a disappointment. Even Zhou Enlai was disappointed with him. He doesn't have the intellect, or he didn't have any intellect, and he wanted to enjoy himself already. Drink expensive wines, and watching Western films. Already showing a decadence or a tendency. So eventually Mao chose Fa Guofeng instead of him to be the successor. Mao wanted him to succeed, to promote him to the vice deputy chairman and so on, everything. But Wang Hun did something that was good, and that's why Mao wanted him, which is during the chaotic years, 1967, 68, factions of workers fight against each other, peasants fighting the workers, students fighting the students fighting with the work against the workers, so on and so forth. Because different sectors of different interests all took the Cultural Revolution theme to fight for their own interest. For instance, the part-time workers, casual workers, took the Cultural Revolution to fight for their rights. They had few rights, like casual part-time workers in Western society these days. They have no pension, no holidays, and so on and so forth. Paid very low. So they took a Cultural Revolution to fight against. So the whole thing, the country was chaotic. This and everything stopped working. This can't last long. And that's why Mao later wanted to bring the army in. But Shanghai did it better. Shanghai formed what they call the Revolutionary Committee, and consisting of the triple three. So one triple is the old-aged, the middle-aged, and the young. The other triple is the old plus party officials who came out after them, and the management from the middle-ranking management and students. And women, certain proportion of women. So they form a revolutionary committee composing of these kind of elements. Put the party organ aside. Complete a new administrative practice. And it worked well. And Shanghai was the best run city in China at that time. I'll give you an example. I met somebody in England when I was studying. Now he's a professor. He was studying in Shanghai, and he told me that some people from Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, they came to China at that time. And then when they came to Shanghai, and they were telling my friend, Stephen, said, this is paradise compared with our countries. Look, all these goods, commodities, all this, everything, everywhere. That was in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay. So, Shanghai, there was no chaos, there was no killing, there was no, so the Gang of Four, basically from Shanghai, and apart from Jiangxin, 这个张春桥、王洪文、姚文渊 are from Shanghai. And another example is Zhang Junqiao, interesting, is the workers, some of the workers, because they're not happy with what happened, so they went to a Anting train station, stopped all the train. It's just chaos, train from Shanghai to Beijing and crossing everywhere over the country. They stopped all the trains. And Zhou Enlai was so worried. And Zhang Junqiao said, I'm going to handle this. He went to Anting, met the workers, the representative of the workers, asked, what do you want? What's the problem? And the workers put this kind of demands to him. He said, okay, I promised to agree with all of them. Now go back, start the training camp. Thus, solve the issue. No party officials dared to do that at that time. So he took the responsibility. And afterwards, Mao said, he did well. That's good. So, it's this famous, well-known Anting 事件, the Anting incident. And the party officials would never forgive him for that. Because some of the party officials really, realistically, they don't say it. They wanted to create chaos, to stop the Cultural Revolution. If the situation was so bad, Mao had to stop it. What right do you have to criticize me? I worked all my life, risk my lives to make this revolution. Now I'm in a position. Why should I give up my power? Why should I accept criticism from you? So you can see it was revolutionary and it was cultural.
That's interesting. How do you think China would look today if Mao's successors had continued with his policies?
That's again interesting. I had a few people tell me, had Mao's policies continued, China would have been better. Just seriously, these people, they're not just in Australian language bogans, or they were educated highly working at the universities. Tell me that suddenly the rural sector would be better. I described in my Gao Ridge book and some other books how the migrant workers suffered, working 14, 16 hours a day and 6, 7 days a week, sleeping in on campus, eating on site, and working like Charlie Chaplin, you put things like that, constantly. It's not life, It's robots, it's slave, and China made these things cheaper for the Western consumers, and 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 take up the pollution as well, because this low tech industry making shoes and clothing very polluting. They suffered a lot. That suffering would not have happened, I don't think. Now, you see what's happening now? The rural sector, they are facing a dilemma. The current authorities. You can't have mechanization, production efficiency with household farming. China had household farming for thousands of years. Now they want to form big unit of working. Then you don't have the collective to do it. So what they do? They encourage the people who could afford it, like investors, to buy up land from the households, saying, if this piece of land, I give you $200 a year, and you give land to me, and I put all land together to do big farming, so I can use machines, so I can be more efficient, which sounds logic, but hardly anyone succeeded. I haven't read any successful stories of that. And local governments, in order to do this, give them subsidies. And some of them just take up subsidies and live without a trace, and leave the land uncultivated. So lots of land uncultivated. And now Chinese could be able to support themselves. They don't starve. They live very well. Yes, that's true. I mean, however, vegetables, fruit, you can grow intensively by swarm farmers and so on and so forth, or even large scale. I'm talking about grains, big, large scale production. So China imports lots of it. This is, officially we still don't know the exact number. Without import, China could not support itself, I don't think. Because in Gao Village, I know that, large portion of land left uncultivated, and they only produce enough food for themselves. If every village is like that, how do you feed the people in the urban sector? Import. So people like Wang Hailong, one of the new left, now, is working on food sovereignty, food security, because you can't depend on import all the time, eventually anyway, if there's war or whatever, like now. That is an issue they can't solve now. They talk about the collectives, but nobody want to go back to the original collectives. But what kind of collectives do you want to have? Very hard to do. It's true. People live better life materially. You can claim in terms of material conditions, the Chinese have never had so good in its total history of 3 or whatever 5,000 years. But people are not happy, anxious, worried. The gap between rich and poor is increasing. Although when Xi Jinping come to power, he tried to, I think, reduce it a bit. But then, when I wrote Gobbler's book, which is terrible, and healthcare, education, why don't people want to have children? Why don't people don't want to get married? Because they don't have any security in life. Couldn't buy a house. If you get sick, you have to pay so much. And again, Xi Jinping is trying to do something about it. I mean, his famous saying, houses are built for living, not for speculation. His famous saying, right? Trying to so the housing price are falling rapidly, although it is not completely collapsed. The government banks still trying to support it, but people are suffering. We know that because the mortgage you pay now is less than the value of the house now because of collapse of price. When you bought it, it's so high. Now it's so low. You still have to pay the loan. Healthcare is the same. The elite, the so-called public servants, they got a very good deal, supreme service, and the medical care for these people is far better than what I have in Australia. In Australia, you have to pay by private property, otherwise you have to queue up for anything, right? Whereas these people just go there anytime. So to the extent that lots of foreigners want to go to have medical service in China, because of course they have the sector for the foreigners, but for the ordinary people, it's not like that. For the elite, for the majority, and for the urban. And that's why people like to go to Beijing, live in Beijing and Shanghai, because they have such resources in education, in healthcare, right? In the most good university in these big cities, and they have lower marks for enrollment or for entry. Whereas if you're from Henan province, Jiangxi province, you have to have 500, 600 marks to get to a university. Whereas Beijing residents, you might only need 400 to get to Beijing University. So there's inequality, unfairness everywhere. Technology, yes, China is making huge progress. Whether it would have happened if Mao's policy still continued, I really don't know. So many other factors, right? Depending. But one thing we have to remember is there's another myth I want to debunk. You asked about the myths, is that China was closed to the West until the death of Mao. That's a myth. Mao actually initiated. First of all, I don't think China wanted to close it to the West. I think it's the opposite. It's the West wanted to close China. I think this is a myth that China was closed to the West. China always wanted to be open to the West, but Western placed sanctions in China, comprehensive sanctions, to the extent during the Great Leap Forward when Chinese people were suffering. So overseas Chinese families couldn't even send the money to their relatives in China. It was forbidden. First of all, it was not true that China wanted to close itself to the West. It was the West who wanted to close China up, like they're doing now to Cuba. Secondly, Mao actually initiated the opening up. And that was possible because the United States of America wanted to play the China card against the Soviet Union. The Kissinger, this great player, chess player internationally, advised Nixon. Nixon himself thought as well that we should play the China card. So he went to visit Beijing in 1971, Kissinger. Arranged Nixon visit in 1972. Because of the Kissinger visit in 1971, and the United Nations voted by a 2/3 majority to accept the PRC as the representative of China, and the Taiwan was ousted. That led to diplomatic relationship with Japan, Australia, for instance, in 1971. When Gough Whitlam, the opposition Labour Party leader, was visiting China in 1971, the Australian media, accusing him of being a traitor, was going to tear him into pieces. But then it was revealed that Kissinger visited China at the same time. And the tone immediately changed. Media, everybody changed. There was a condition for China to be open, for the West in, or China out. It was already in early 1970s, created the conditions by Mao, not Deng Xiaoping, post Mao. So that's another myth,
You first published this book in 2008 and expressed criticism regarding the direction taken by Mao's successors. How do you think things have changed since then?
Well, for one thing, for instance, if Mao were alive, or if his successors were to hold China together, it wouldn't have the 1979 Chinese invasion of Vietnam. And Deng Xiaoping did that soon after his visit to the United States of America. It was Deng's indication to say, I submit to you, United States of America. Let me be part of you. Put our head on, that kind of things. Mao would never done that. So now China can only claim, since 1979, China has never had a war. But if Deng Xiaoping didn't do that, he could say since 1949, the PRC established, China had never invaded any country. But China participated in the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, and also the border dispute with India. But that was not an invasion, right? I think China's development would be more balanced. And now, of course, during the era of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, I think Hu Jintao did one good thing. In 2005, he abolished agricultural tax. That's the first time in Chinese history of 2,500 years. The rural sector is not taxed. That was great. And Jiang Zemin, I think, as a premier, from my point of view, was the least successful and the most harmful period. First of all, the introduction of commercialization and entrepreneurship to education and healthcare was by Zhou Rongji. Zhou Rongji was very right-wing, and that the consequences are still being felt today. China could have a much better healthcare system like Cuba. Cuba is very poor, but its healthcare is still good. And education, now it's so, the Chinese use the word 内传, evolutionary. So much time, so much effort spent on education with hardly any good results or even harmful results. Children, they already study 10 hours a day and they still have to do work on weekends. And they already have very intensive working hours. And they still have to have extra curriculum teaching. And parents pay a huge amount of money. And every time, even a kid of 7, 8 years old come back home, they have to do homework and parents have to sit beside them. Otherwise, they don't do it. Of course, they're so young. And it's just crazy. The whole thing is crazy. It's so competitive. And rural people couldn't compete. Just urban middle class sectors to compete against each other. To the extent is that it's even cheaper to send the kids to be educated in Australia, for instance, which is ridiculous. And corruption is structural, so that it's hard to find anybody who is not corrupted. In order to stop this, Xi Jinping has to target somebody. And of course, he is accused of being targeting his political rivals. I don't think that is true, because almost everybody is corrupted in this structural corruption. In order to get rid of it, you have to make a structural change, which is hard. And also you have to, and his idea is to firstly make sure you don't, you dare not, and then eventually you will not by yourself, like say Hong Kong. Right? First you have to strike very hard to have a deterrent. This is what they did in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is listed corrupted societies in the world, so they claim anyway. But some of the things that, I mean, if you want to have construction like you bid, right? It's in West is the same. How do you, I've always like universities, like you have a building, it's $100 million. But why 100? Why not 99 or 98? That's a big figure. It's just you bid, you know, you make money out of it. And then in the process, of course, whether you have guanxi, connections or relatives, influence, school ties, or advertising, or money, or bribe, everything you can think of, yeah, it happens everywhere. So China, of course, has that as well. The other thing, of course, the people both in China and the West are not happy with the Xi Jinping government is that compared with previous two governments, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, there is a much strict control of freedom of speech, and people are less fear, and they feel less fear. Less fear. I think this is for two reasons. One is that Xi Jinping's anti-corruption and his policies face lots of opposition from the party and the elite. And if you let loose, he might not be able to control it. And the second one is, of course, the West, especially the United States of America, as you probably know, want to have a color revolution in China. They want the CPC to collapse. China can be so-called democratic, like Ukraine. And that's what they wanted. Although what is democratic? You could say, Hitler was democratically elected, Trump was democratically elected, and so was Putin. Anyway, so the Chinese, especially the establishment, Xi Jinping himself, was worried that China would collapse like the Soviet Union. And therefore, in order to prevent that from happening, you need some control, especially Western media influence.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
I suppose these days, easy to get book from Amazon. I don't like Amazon, but that's how it is. You can easily get a book from them, and also even secondhand. Secondhand is much cheaper. Some people read it and want to sell it. I don't mind. If you guys are desperate, anybody, your audience, if they find difficult to access or don't want to get to Amazon, you can write to me. I'll arrange something. I have recently edited two books. One is Different History, Common Futures, looking about the differences between especially Australia and China, and to see whether there's a common ground for the two countries to live together peacefully. But that applies to all the Western countries, not just Anglo-Saxons. The so-called Western countries, to put mildly, are very anxious about China, about the rise of China. But lots of them are very hostile because they think China was, thanks to Lungchang and Halliday, a country run by monsters, how can you not get rid of them? How can you live with them? So I want to show that it's possible. And I wrote a chapter in which I argue that the Communist Party of China actually holds more modern values than the non-CPC people in China, like women's equality, workers' rights, universal healthcare, universal education. That's the ideas of what Xi Jinping called the 初心, original ideas. So there was a survey done by reputable academics to look at the members of the Communist Party and ask them about certain values, and then look at the Chinese who are not members of the Communist Party. In fact, the members of the Communist Party have more things in common with the Western people than the non-members. So I'm trying to say, if you're talking about modernization, modern values, the CCP is not against it, or at least ideally, according to CPC constitution, and the values that supposed to hold. But in practice, there are always differences, variations. So I was trying to say, we're different in many ways, in tradition, in values, but we all change. And China has changed a lot, become more and more modern, more and more Western. In fact, if you look at women's status, it's like employment, female employment rate is among the highest in the world. If you look at women's status, actually, in many ways, they're better than those in Japan, let alone India, which is not democracy. So that's the contribution made by the CPC, by the revolution. Most recently, another book edited by me is looks at whether there's a possibility of a delink of the West from China. It's interesting. Lots of people don't think delink is possible. No, we're still working out, what to do with each other. EU is trying to work out. United States is trying to work out. So is Australia. I again contribute a chapter telling the reader that China is a very complex society these days. And one thesis, one major argument is that there are three different value systems working in China at the moment, or narratives. One is the traditional narrative, Confucianism. One is the Communist Party revolutionary narrative. And one is the Western democracy, individualism, human rights narrative. And I argue that all these narratives coexist in China at the moment. Sometimes they interact, they overlap, sometimes they run conflict against each other. For instance, the stress on education, Confucianism overlaps with the communist government at the moment, or the Chinese people. But educating the poor, the lower class people, is very much human rights, individual, and democracy. The CCP is not against that, at least. The revolutionary narrative. So sometimes they overlap, support each other, sometimes run counter. So China is a complex society because of that, but it's changing fast. In other words, you can't say you delink or don't delink China because of ideology. That's too simple. You can't say you want to delink because China is such a crazy society. It's so totally different from us. That's not true. So, yeah.
Professor Gao, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you ongoing success in your work.
Thank you.